This is an I Am Listening original podcast.
We have to win back the public's trust. And the ways to do that, I think, are to be, competent, thoughtful, and most importantly, which is unfortunately difficult to do in opposition, but we'll have to do what we said we're going to do. So, on something like immigration, that's become, or that has been sort of thought of as a left or right issue. But the problem there is more that we said that we would do something. The public voted for what it is we said that we would do, and then we didn't do it. And so wherever you sit on the spectrum, you can't do that.
Welcome to the Kent Politics Podcast, your go-to source for insightful discussions on local and national political matters. Join us as we take a deep dive into local government across the county. Find out what the key decision makers have to say, what your money is being spent on, and how the party's policies could affect how we live. Plus, don't miss our regular feature, Westminster Watch, where we dissect the latest developments and decisions shaping the political landscape in the heart of the UK's capital. Engage with us as we delve into the issues that matter to you and explore the dynamic world of politics from a Kent perspective.
Welcome to the Kent Politics Podcast. In the week the sun finally came out and solar farms are back in the news, Medway's future is back under the microscope, and we find out the extent of the backlog at the county's courts. I'm Simon Finlay, local democracy reporter covering Kent County Council, and I'm joined by Dan Essen, who covers the borough and district councils in Kent. Hello. And we're joined also by Robert Boddy, who covers Medway Council.
Hello.
And the KM Group Political Editor, Paul Francis, for his take on what's been happening in Westminster.
Hello.
And our special guest this week is a rare breed indeed, a new Conservative MP. She is Katie Lam, who won the Weald of Kent seat at the general election, only one of 6 Tories in Kent at Westminster. First up, Dan, what's been going on in your neck of the woods?
So I've actually been revisiting a story which some long-time listeners may recognise. Way back in early March, I spoke about Swale Borough Council's decision to refuse planning permission for the safety plan for a gigantic solar farm at Graveney between Faversham and Whitstable. At the time, planning officers and some councillors said that the council was making a major mistake in trying to refuse this plan, and lo and behold, it's now come back to bite them.
OK, so what happened then?
So we discussed similar things before, and listeners may know that when council planning committees make a decision in contravention of planning law, they can get taken to an appeal by developers. They're heard at the planning inspectorate, which is basically like a planning committee but run by the national government. Back when Swale councils refused the battery safety plan for Clearfield Solar Park, they were being told by planning officers and an independent consultant that if they did it, there was nothing officially wrong with the plans, and they were opening themselves up to quite severe risk of retaliation, essentially, if they refused it. But nonetheless, the council voted to refuse it, and a few days ago a decision noticed by the planning inspectorate came out saying that the council's decision was unreasonable and has led to basically a massive waste of time and money for everyone involved.
Speaking of money, what happens now? Surely Swale Council aren't just getting a slap on the wrist and a stern letter, are they?
No, certainly not. The planning inspectorate decisions are kind of like civil court rulings. The loser is forced to pay the fees for the appellant who brought it. It's not yet known how much the cost will be, and typically planning system fashion, that will probably take a very long time to work out. But nonetheless, Clearfield was a huge project, 880,000 solar panels, one of the biggest solar farms in the UK. So it's safe to assume they splashed out pretty well on lawyers, consultants and so on to go to the appeal, even if the council's case was pretty easy for them to defeat. So realistically, it's probably safe to assume that the cost to Swale Borough Council and ultimately Swale's taxpayers will be in the tens of thousands, I'd guess.
So where's that going to come from then?
Well, no one quite knows yet. Councils, funnily enough, don't budget for losing appeals at the planning inspectorate, so the money has to come from other council budgets, which, a few tens of thousands isn't a huge amount of money in overall council terms, but with councils under quite a lot of financial pressure, that's money that's meant to be going towards other services, which is now going to have to basically pay for a mistake which everyone seems to realise was avoidable and predictable at the time.
Turning to Robert, what about Medway? What's been happening there?
Well, there's a fair amount going on in Medway, most significant of all being the proposals for Medway's local plan, which went back out for consultation this week, but now with 3 possible options for how the towns are going to develop over the next 15 years. OK, Medway has had a few problems with their local plan over the years, if I'm not wrong. Yes, so the last one was put in place in 2003, and they're only supposed to last for 15 years. But when it came time to renew it in 2018, the previous Tory administration couldn't get it over the line because of internal disagreements over what land should be designated for what, and a perceived rush process which was full of flaws and had to be sent back. The new Labour administration had made getting a local plan in place a key priority when they were elected last year, but it's not been smooth sailing for them either. Michael Gove called them out at a national press conference for the Department of Levelling Up in December for being one of the worst councils in the country in terms of lacking a plan.
Okay, and so what are the options?
So the local plan previously went out to consultation in September last year, but it's come back again for another, and this time there are more concrete pathways for development in the area. There are 3 options, which the council calls urban focus, which is prioritising brownfield sites in urban centres and waterfront sites, and accessible areas that benefit from good transport links. Dispersed growth, which is less about brownfield and more about opening up greenfield sites on the Hoo Peninsula, Capstone Valley, and land to the west of Medway, which forms the green belt around London. And the blended option, which is a brownfield first focus with around 50% of new development being on brownfield sites, but also has a range of suburban and rural area sites close to existing towns and villages. The designation of Chatham Docks is likely to receive a great deal of attention when the final version is picked, as one of these 3 options would switch it to a residential-led area, which, as we've covered before, is quite controversial. The local plan was always going to be a difficult process, and the council leader Vince Maple has said to me that he knows everyone will find something they don't like about it, but there's no local plan which pleases everyone. But it's about finding a plan which most people are broadly in favour of. The consultation is currently open and lasts until September 1st.
And what have you been working on, Simon?
Well, the Kent Police and Crime Commissioner Matthew Scott was at County Hall in the week for the Crime and Policing panel to talk about the backlog of cases clogging up the court system.
I think we need to recruit more staff. It's really simple. We have 2 problems which are contributing most to this. Number 1 is the amount of work the police are presenting to the courts, i.e. the number of people that they are charging. And the second is capacity, not just physical capacity, but we don't have enough judges for our Crown courts. We don't have enough legal advisors for our magistrates' courts. The key to this is a big recruitment campaign, not just in terms of getting the numbers in, but making sure that people know how much we value those roles and that they deserve fair recompense. So the key to this is really simple. We need to get those people in place.
You've also said that if you build more prisons, you build them and fill them. Do you think that's still the answer to the question of, the justice system working more?
I do. I mean, I regret that we didn't build the prison places we promised to build. In fact, I think we have fewer than in the last Parliament, and we now have a government promising to build more prison places. So my aspiration rings true. Yes, you can do a lot of things to help get behind underlying problems with drugs, with alcohol, etc., and rehabilitation. Absolutely, you can do all of those things, but prison still has to be there as a sanction and a deterrent, and therefore if prisons are built, we have enough people going through our court systems at the moment that we could fill them.
It turns out that Kent is second only behind Manchester for being jammed. The number of cases backed up is now 164% higher than it was 4 years ago.
And what's been causing this? Is Kent a national crime hotspot? Or?
Well, there was already a backlog before the pandemic, but the pandemic really caused a massive queue to form, particularly at Crown Court level, where specialist courts and cell suites are required. But there are a host of other reasons. One is that there's a shortage of judges, there's a shortage of lawyers, there's a shortage of probation staff, legal advisors, clerk, and the list goes on. Another reason is that the government recently recruited 20,000 new police officers. Well, Kent got its fair share of those recruits, and once they've been trained, they've started arresting people and charging more people, and consequently more people are going through the court system. There is also a shortage of suitable court space at Maidstone Crown Court, for instance, and some of the magistrates' courts are not really fit for purpose, i.e. the demand that's being placed upon them. None of this reflects on the ongoing state of prisons, which are also full. And earlier this year, we might recall that Mr. Scott announced his stance on the prison shortages. He said, build them and fill them.
And how's the backlog affecting people who are actually involved in these criminal cases?
Well, clearly this is not great for the victims of crime or their families, who have to wait years of giving evidence, and some of whom are simply now walking away from the cases. And it's not great for defendants either, who have to put their lives on hold until they have their cases heard. The barrister I spoke to says the cases today will not be heard until 2026 at the earliest. Right, I now return to Paul Francis, the KM Group Political Editor. It was King's Speech this week. Anything in it to affect Kent?
Yes, indeed there was, and it's worth noting the historic nature of the occasion amid all the pomp and circumstance and why it's important. And the principal reason is that we are seeing the first signs of what a new Labour government led by Sir Keir will look like. And one of the key issues that we already know about is the controversial subject of planning reform, which Dan earlier referred to in his story. Now, during the election campaign, this proved to be a bit of a political flashpoint between Labour and the Conservatives, both zoned in on the demand for affordable homes. Reforms on this include the need to speed up the planning process, and there's one or two other clauses or proposals which are not going to go down too well with residents in communities where there's a distinct lack of infrastructure.
One of the other things that was in the King's Speech is that the Labour say they're going to essentially institutionalise the power of the Office for Budget Responsibility to consult on all major tax and spend decisions. So do you not think maybe they've given themselves essentially a get-out card because any of the plans in the King's Speech which might involve too much spending or tax in the eyes of the OBR will be advised against, and then the Labour government can just say, well, the experts say we shouldn't do it, so we won't?
Well, it's a good point, and we know that the controversial budget that wasn't a budget by Liz Truss, I don't even remember this, back in the day, doesn't seem very long away, she produced a spending programme which she said wasn't a budget, a mini budget. And of course, not being a proper budget, it didn't get scrutinised by the OBR. So I don't know whether that answers your question or not about.
Okay. The other thing, was there anything in the King's Speech about small boat crossings? That's something that affects Kent directly.
Oh, yes. Yeah, definitely. There was a reference to the government taking steps to curb the number of crossings, as all political parties have done in one shape, form or fashion. The plan is for a border security board, I think it is. I
think Border Security Command, I think it's called.
Yeah, the BCA. But there's very little detail on what's going to be involved in this particular appointment, other than that the person who heads it is going to be directly answerable to the Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper. But reading through some of the additional kind of material, it doesn't really tell us exactly what's going to change. They just talk about the rhetoric of taking tougher sanctions, tougher action, liaising with the French authorities to crack down on people smuggling. And we've heard a lot of this before, and it didn't strike me as if there's anything particularly new in it.
Well, Keir Starmer has said that that when he was the DPP, that they were able to thwart some terrorist attacks by good intelligence and working behind the scenes. And perhaps this is what's going to happen, is that work will be done behind the scenes, and then suddenly we'll find that the small boat crossings won't be such an issue after all, because they've done the work sort of very quietly in the background.
That's possible, and I think the Labour government's intention in this has been to avoid questions around these security operations by saying that it would compromise the kind of integrity and security of those taking place in them. But as I say, I mean, not a huge amount of detail in there. But as you rightly say, there's always a lot of activity going on behind the scenes that we don't get to hear about.
Well, none of it seems to work very well in the past 30 years, actually, because even with the best brains in Whitehall, the people traffickers seem to be one step ahead of them every time.
Yeah, they do. And that's, I think there is something in the fact that the solution lies with better relationships and collaborations with the French authorities, but doesn't seem to be happening on a regular basis.
Well, it didn't even happen when we were part of Europe, so it's always a stiffer task than it was even then.
Yeah, I think there's potential here for this to be a kind of vulnerable for Labour if their plans don't work, and they've spent months and months telling us that the Conservative plans wouldn't work, and now their own plans are going to be justly scrutinised.
Was there anything missed out, something that you thought might be in there that isn't in there?
Well, we did think there was the plan for lowering the age of voting, which Labour had signalled it would support in the general election campaign, and it seems that has been quietly dropped.
It was in their manifesto, but it wasn't in the King's Speech. But there was something in the King's Speech about modernising our democracy, so they might sort of absorb it under that.
Yes, I think you're right, Dan.
If they do it at all, that is.
But no explicit reference to that proposal, which some people, found quite attractive, but not to be on this occasion.
OK, thank you very much, Steve. Paul.
Is there a topic that you would like to be discussed on the Kent Politics podcast? Perhaps you've got a question for one of our panel, or you'd like to comment on a hot topic in local or national government. Get Get in touch by emailing or sending a voice note to kentpoliticspodcast@thekmgroup.co.uk.
The new MP for the newly created Weald of Kent constituency is Katie Lam, who was one of a small band of Conservatives who got elected on July the 4th. Katie Lam, welcome to the Kent Politics Podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. First of all, congratulations on being returned as the Weald of Kent MP. You're a new MP in a new Parliament with a new ruling party in a new constituency for a party that's just been trounced by Labour. How does that feel a few days into the job?
Well, thank you for the congratulations. I mean, as you mentioned, there's lots of different components, and I have different feelings about the different bits and pieces. But overall, I'm just so happy and excited and proud to represent the Weald of Kent, where I live. As you say, this new seat, it's a proper rural seat. It's a real countryside constituency. And so getting stuck into that and trying to, as quickly as I possibly can, set everything up so that I can start helping my constituents is my top priority, and that's what I'm finding kind of particularly interesting and exciting. But of course, it was not a great night for the Conservative Party, and that's a shame.
Yeah, you were at the same election count as Damien Green, who lost his seat after nearly 30 years in Parliament. Mm-hmm. It was an evening of kind of mixed emotions. On the one hand, your team were obviously pleased that you had won, but at the same time, you had Damien, who was bowing out of Parliament after a long period. Yeah,
it was very sad, and Damien, one of a number of great colleagues who have worked incredibly hard for their constituents over, exactly as you say, a very long time, and good new candidates too. I had hoped to be in a bit of a crew of new Conservative MPs from Kent, and I think actually I am the only one, so that was not to be. So exactly as you say, it's a bit of a mixed bag of emotions.
If you would have bet against a Conservative win in the Weald of Kent, did you ever worry that the Reform UK threat might cause an upset despite doing very little on the ground?
Yes, I was worried about a number of different possible outcomes, I think. I think this year, of all years, though this is very important to do always, you can't take anything for granted. I remember I worked on the 2019 general election campaign, and I remember so well when Sedgefield, which had been Tony Blair's seat, fell, if you like, to the Conservatives, became a Conservative seat. And the lesson from that, not that we should need to learn it, is nobody can be taken for granted. Nobody should be taken for granted in our democracy. There's a responsibility to fight for every vote and to get your message out to every voter. And so, yeah, I thought it was quite possible that people might want something different, whether that might be Labour or Reform, who ended up doing sort of similarly on the night. So absolutely, I was concerned.
So like you mentioned there, you were hoping to be entering Parliament with a new crew of Kent Tory MPs, but both in Kent and the country, there's not many left. In the 2019 general election, 16 out of 17 Kent constituencies had Tory MPs. There's now 18 constituencies, and only 6 of them are held by Conservatives. It took a pretty serious battering. Where did it all go so wrong? Why are people so angry with the Conservatives?
I think, unfortunately, we failed to do what we said we were going to do in some respects. We were dealt quite a tough hand, but we didn't always play it as well as we should have done. And whether that is, if we look at 2019 and all the things that people voted for in 2019, they voted for change, and they voted for better public services, and they voted for immigration to come down, and all sorts of things that, as I say, in some respects, not really the fault of the government. The pandemic in particular, I think, which was a sort of once in a century nightmare, is the best example of that. But some other things where really the government could and should have done better. And I think people felt that the Conservatives had their chance to show that they were going to do what they said they were going to do, and that is democracy, and rightly so.
So, like I mentioned, your seat is a new one created out. It's absolutely sprawling. It's got something like 18, 90 villages in it. So you've got a lot to get to grips with. What are the local issues on the ground which people are telling you about, and which are becoming your priorities?
So I would say there are local issues which apply broadly across the whole seat, and then of course, like anywhere, there are more localised issues even within the area, because as you say, it's very large. It's about 300 square miles, I think. So across the area, healthcare is very important. Overdevelopment, people mention to me a lot. Farming is very important. The whole agriculture ecosystem is a really important part, not just of our economy, but also of our culture. Crime and rural crime, people are very concerned about. Various infrastructural things, they're also related to overdevelopment, things like water supply. And then you have localised issues. So the non-selective school in Cranbrook was closed a few years ago, and lots of parents there are very concerned about having to send their children a long way to go to school. There has been a terrible, long-term flighted thing. It doesn't really cover it, sort of mass industrial waste dumping in a beautiful wood in or near Bethersden, and that's a big concern for the people who live there. So there's a mixture, I would say, of some themes and then some individual campaigns and concerns.
At the hustings last month in Tenterden, you spoke quite movingly about your family and how they fled Nazi Germany. Can you just tell the listeners about that part of your life?
Of course. So my grandmother came to this country when she was 13 years old, and her family were journalists and politicians. They were left-wing journalists and politicians, actually. They were socialists in Germany in the 1920s and 1930s, and they were fierce critics of Hitler and of the Nazis. And so when they came to power, they were stripped of their citizenship. My great-great-grandfather, many of the family were in prison. My great-great-grandfather jumped out of his second floor prison cell and sort of crawled to Czechoslovakia on a broken ankle. I've been to see the prison. It's amazing. They set up a resistance radio station in Czechoslovakia as was. They broadcast back over the border. They were raided by the SS. One of the operators was shot dead. And so eventually they came to freedom in England. My grandfather's family, who were Dutch Jews, lived in Amsterdam, were almost exclusively murdered in the Holocaust. They were killed in Auschwitz and in Sobibor. So when I was a child and when I was growing up, politics and the power of politics was something that we took very seriously and had quite a reverence for. We weren't cynical about politics in my family because we had seen, for good and for bad, what politics can do.
You got us through your career. You went to a state comprehensive before winning a place at Cambridge University. So what was your journey into politics?
I became quite involved with politics at university. I'd always been involved in or interested in, I suppose you would say, current affairs, maybe rather than politics or how the world is run. And then when I went to Cambridge, I became quite involved. I was chairman of the Conservatives there, and I was president of something called the Cambridge Union, which is a big debating society that they have. And so got involved with the Conservative Party then and joined as a member. And so I then had a career in finance, but tried to stay, volunteering and leafleting and delivering and all of those good things on the side. And then in 2019, I was offered a job in Number 10, which I took. So I went and worked there for a couple of years, which was fascinating. And then I worked for an AI company, actually. And then I went to go and work for the Home Office. I did counter-terrorism there. And then became a candidate. I
read somewhere that you were advisor to Boris Johnson and Suella Braverman. Is that correct? Just the record?
Yes, so I worked in Number 10. I worked under Boris Johnson. I then later I worked for Rishi Sunak. I worked in his leadership campaign, and then I worked for Suella Braverman in the Home Office. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, just explain, if you can, without pigeonholing yourself, why the Conservative Party and your brand of conservatism.
I describe my brand of conservatism as common sense conservative values. So law and order, a secure border, the importance of the countryside, reverence for our history and traditions and pride in those, a strong economy, free markets, a secure border, hard work, individual opportunity, aspiration.
Would you describe your sort of say that you're more on the right or to the left of the Conservative family?
I think it depends on the issue. I would say broadly somewhere in the middle to the right, depending on exactly what it is. I think it's very important to be tough on crime, for example. And I think it's important to leave people to go about their lives and for the government, not to be too involved, to have a relatively small state. I think that's very important.
Mm-hmm.
But if it comes to, sort of more societal choices, I suppose, I broadly think that we should, live and let live and leave each other to get on with it.
As we stand here speaking, your party, Conservative Party, nationally is pretty much a smouldering ruin. Do you think it will be able to rebuild itself?
Yes, I do. It's what in a way is both very sad for the moment and very important for the future, and is something that that gives me very much the hope that it will be able to rebuild itself. Is, in my experience at least, I can only really speak about the world of Kent because that's the only place that I spent this election, but people had not at all given up on or abandoned Conservative principles. They just didn't any longer trust the Conservative Party. So I think all of the ideas still hold and all of the ideas are still good. It's about being able to rebuild that credibility. And I think there's every reason to think that can be done. The party's 200 years old. And as you say, it has definitely been reduced, but, we've still got over 120 members of parliament representing their constituencies in Westminster and at home. And, that is clearly a much smaller force than we have been, but it's definitely not nothing. And we will be able to rebuild from there, but that's not to say that it's going to be easy.
Would it be a mistake for the Tories to move to the right to counteract the threat from reform?
I don't think it's necessarily really about ideology in that left and right kind of a way. I think we have to be credible. I think we have to stop fighting one another. And we have to win back the public's trust. And the ways to do that, I think, are to be, competent, thoughtful, and most importantly, which is unfortunately difficult to do in opposition, but we'll have to do what we said we're going to do. So, on something like immigration, that's become, or that has been sort of thought of as a left or right issue. But the problem there is more that we said that we would do something. The public voted for what it is we said that we would do, and then we didn't do it. And so wherever you sit on the spectrum, you can't do that.
Finally, what are your own personal political ambitions?
At the moment, the most important thing, I think, in this government, for better or worse, Labour is a relatively urban party. The government now is represented by, consists of MPs who mostly represent very urban seats and the cabinet too. And so my great ambition at the moment is to stand up for and be a voice for the countryside. Somebody is going to need to champion our shared rural way of life. And that is something that I take very seriously. And that's what I'm going to try and do.
Katie Lam, thank you very much indeed. Newly elected MP for the Weald of Kent. Thanks for joining us today. And please keep in touch.
Thank you for having me. Of course.
OK, Katie is one of only 6 Conservative MPs left in Kent, and 3 of them have jobs in the Shadow Cabinet. Faversham and Mid-Kent's Helen Whately is the Shadow Secretary of State for Transport. Laura Trott at Sevenoaks is still Chief Secretary to the Treasury Brief in opposition, while Tom Tugendhat retains his security role as the Shadow Minister. Tom Tugendhat, I'm told, is taking soundings for what is left of the Conservative Parliamentary Party and trying to find whether he might make a good fit. Would he have the support, and could he unite the party? What do you reckon then, Paul?
Well, we know he had a go at it last time around and got turned out, as it were, in round 3. But he was widely seen as having led quite an effective, slick leadership bid. I think his problem is that we don't yet really know how the remaining Conservative Party at Westminster splits in terms of whether they're left of centre-right or right-wing. And I think that may be why he's not yet going public with it. And I think the other issue about going public first is he can be seen in that kind of odd British way of being a bit too forceful rather than, the kind of the standard response you get from MPs when you ask them if they wanted to be something bigger than they are. They say, oh, well, there's no job vacancy for me. I can possibly go to so-and-so. So I think his taking soundings is obviously what's going on. And the other thing is, we don't yet have any indication of who else might be in the running, and I think that's going to be important.
Well, he obviously would be a centrist, wouldn't he? He wouldn't be of the right. But it really depends on how the Tories decide to take on the Reform Party.
This is what I think will be important, is the fact that I don't think any leader could meaningfully unite the Conservative Party as it stands right now, because any leader drawn from the relative centre, like Tom Tugendhat, that sort of One Nationers, is going to be constantly besieged by the sort of right of the party, saying they should go harder on immigration, they should lean more towards Nigel Farage and the sort of reform voter market. And any leader from the right of the party is going to be besieged by the centre, sort of centrist One Nation type, saying that they're too extreme and we need to recapture the centre in British politics. So it's a poison chalice basically either way, and also for at least another 6 months nobody's really going to listen to anything the Tories say because they're reduced to a sort of rump opposition.
Which makes you wonder why Tom Tugendhat would want it anyway, because surely the time to strike is when you've got one leader who will be a sort of probably a temporary fix until the party decide that it's not working and they need to pick somebody else. So maybe he would be better in biding his time to find out just how the Conservative Party is likely to shape up in the end.
Yeah, I agree. That's got to be on his mind. I mean, it does slightly remind me of a very odd situation when Ken Clarke was bidding for the leadership of the Conservative Party. It got to a stage where he joined forces in a kind of a relationship with John Redwood, who was a vehemently right on the right of the party as the dream ticket. So it didn't turn out to be a dream at all. It turned out to be a bit of a nightmare. So.
But having said that, when Keir Starmer took over, I mean, the Conservatives had an 80-seat majority. He took a punt and he won big.
Yeah, it's interesting that Tom Tugendhat, when he's asked about his leadership ambitions, has said in the past, well, you've got to be. So it's a bit like the lottery. You've got to buy a ticket to be in it to win it. So he's well aware of that. But as I say, I'm with Dan on this. I think it's going to be important for him in reaching that decision how the remainder of the Conservative rump of the party, which got eviscerated at the general election, where they stand politically in terms of that spectrum of left and right.
Okay, folks, that's your lot. Thanks to Rob, Dan, Paul, and to our special guest, Katie Lam. And don't forget to keep an eye on Kent Online for the latest politics news from across the county. All the best now.
Thanks for listening to the Kent Politics Podcast. Don't forget to check out stories throughout the week on the politics page of Kent Online. And you can watch the Kent Politics Show with Rob Bailey on KMTV every Friday at 5 p.m. or on demand at kmtv.co.uk.
This has been an I Am Listening original podcast. For more information, head over to our website, im-listening.co.uk.